Hey guys, don't you just love it when something that you're relatively passionate about becomes part of the everyday conversation that you are surrounded by? That was my experience recently watching the Honorable Prime Minister Theresa May of the UK involved in an ITV Facebook Live Q&A session. And in that session, a lady called in who suffered from severe anxiety, and she talked about how she uses cannabis or marijuana to help treat the severity of her symptoms. And she posed to the PM the prospect of legalization and wanted to hear her views. Now, I have tremendous respect for Miss Theresa May. I understand she's not an expert on these things. She's been given talking points by the party, and she's definitely towing the line about being tough on drugs, and I totally get that. But I thought it would be fun if I would respond to at least three of the major points that she's raised, and I'll raise a fourth point about some of the benefits to kind of suggest that many of the issues that she's raising may not be as clear cut and as easily understood as many people may perceive. Now, the first issue that she raised was this issue pertaining to the idea of cannabis being linked to mental illness. Now, a lot of people talk about using cannabis and they talk about some of the paranoia that they're exposed to. But again, that has a lot to do with the strain of marijuana that you're dealing with. The other big one, as I said, the PM was not specific, but they say there's a causal link between cannabis use and the use issues related to schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia worldwide has remained relatively low at about maybe 1.1%. It has been known to go up as high as 3% in other kind of metropolitan areas, but generally it is a very, very small portion of the society. However, in contrast, the use of cannabis has been exponentially growing, at least from the 1960s onwards. And we would expect that if there was a causal link between cannabis leading on to schizophrenia, we should expect that the percentage of people suffering from schizophrenia in any given society would naturally increase. But the data does not actually show that. It actually shows that it's been pretty steady. However, the reverse has actually been suggested. That is, that people who are prone to schizophrenia through some kind of traumatic happening within their life, they tend to go towards mind-altering drugs such as marijuana and LSD and some of these other things. They tend to be prone to using these other substances. So some people point and say, well, in places where cannabis is legal, or places where cannabis is at least medically available, you tend to see higher percentages of people with mental illness or schizophrenia in those areas. But again, I will suggest that, correlation does not mean causation. Just like this caller who called in pertaining to her anxiety, that basically said every time she goes to get her medication, she is criminalized by the prohibition. It is not uncommon for a person that uses cannabis to deal with their symptoms to go to some place where it is at least legally available and they do not have to deal with the possible legal implications. So of course in those areas, people who are suffering or people who want to use these things, they're going to flock there, and they may skew a lot of the statistical data. So again, correlation does not necessarily mean causation. The second major issue that the Honorable PM actually rose was this idea that somehow the marijuana of today is a lot stronger and it's more potent than that of our parents and grandparents and so on of the 1960s and 70s. Now, she didn't offer any kind of explanation to this, but I am familiar with this talking point. A lot of people point to the fact that if you look at the rehab networks that are available out there, there are so many young people that are actually in this system right now. And a lot of people point and say, well, you see, when I was a young person, I didn't have this issue, but all of these young people, they can't handle the levels. Thereby, the marijuana must be so much more potent. And to them, again, I will suggest that, again, correlation does not mean causation. When a young person is arrested for marijuana use or possession or whatever the case might be, many times, after a couple of warnings, if the habit is repeated, they're given a choice. Either, go to some kind of detention center or possibly prison, or go to rehab. And of course, the young person is just going to naturally choose the lesser of the two evils, which is to go into rehab. So it is in fact the prohibition that is giving, young people, forcing them into rehab, because the consequences, of course, otherwise is prison or some detention center. So again, that does not necessarily mean that the marijuana is more dangerous or anything along those lines. It is in fact an indictment against the prohibition of marijuana. But even if it is true, even if the THC levels in what's available today are much higher and somehow dangerous to people, because of the prohibition, we have no regulatory ability to limit that in any capacity. The prohibition has allowed the black market and the criminal element to do what they want to the levels of THC. So again, anybody who may be pointing to that to some kind of evidence, it's actually suggesting that the prohibition is the problem and we have no controls over it, as we see people have been exposed to it and people are buying it despite the fact that it's still illegal. Now, the third is a very common objection, is the idea that somehow marijuana is a gateway drug, leading people down, the path to harder and harder drugs. Now, there is a lot of studies about this, especially in places where it's been decriminalized, in Uruguay and Amsterdam and the states, a couple of the states within the Americas. And again, there is the reverse suggestion. It is because of the prohibition of marijuana, people are forced to buy their marijuana from a dealer who may also be selling harder and harder drugs. So because of that, because of the prohibition, people are thereby exposed and are putting themselves at risk because of that exposure. Now, in places like Amsterdam, where it is legal in the coffee shops, the number of people in the society that actually move on to harder and harder drugs is much lower than that of the UK. Suggesting again, it is the prohibition and the black market that these dealers could create an artificial shortage of cannabis and then spin around and suggest, well, hey, maybe try some cocaine or heroin or whatever the case might be. But if we were able to pull it out from the black market, bring it into the light and treat it like alcohol or cigarettes, regulate it, and also suggest that ID is required for users of a particular age, this would in fact solve a lot of the problem, as long as the price that we arrive at is below that of the black market price. Because of course, if we tax it too much and make it too expensive, there's just naturally going to be a black market anyway. And with that said, a lot of people point to, a lot of the terrible horror stories of people who've used drugs, harder drugs. Many people have even taken their lives. And I'm going to say a lot of that has happened under the current system of prohibition. So even though, you may be advocating and saying that, we should keep this stuff illegal, just understand that more of the status quo is not going to solve any of these problems. And I believe it's time to have a smart conversation about these issues, and especially when the people who are dealing with the most severe cases of addiction, schizophrenia, and these other things, these are broken people with mental issues, and the matter should be handled more specifically in the medical community rather than the criminal justice system. And on my final point of this, again, unrelated to what the PM said, just some of the benefits that we've seen within the communities that have actually, in fact, legalized marijuana. It has been shown that people who are on prescription drugs for treating of their pain or whatever conditions they have, when they're in a place where cannabis can be used medically or even recreationally, there is a cost effect where they use less and less prescription drugs, leading to a savings, to their national insurance or their medical plans. So for us in the UK, this is a potential saving of money for the National Health Service, which I think is a phenomenal option. And at the same time, it has been shown that the tax revenues coming from these sales can also come in. One study I saw for the UK suggested as much as £1 billion of revenue may come into the treasury if we regulated the cannabis market like alcohol and cigarettes. So again, I think that's a phenomenal benefit. Some of that money can definitely go to help people who are really struggling with drug addiction and schizophrenia and other drug-related issues. And I think that is a much smarter and more humane way of dealing with this issue. So again, guys, the debate will continue. I'm glad to be a part of it. Please put your comments below. If you disagree with me, that's completely fine. we can have that discussion. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you'd like to see more. Guys, as always, I thank you for watching. Take care. All the best.